Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County Historian Walter Gable. The topic of this program is the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, one of the most visited tourist sites in the Finger Lakes. It is designated as an Audubon Important Bird area, providing critical migration and nesting habitat for all kinds of waterfowl and birds, and hence is a great tourist mecca. The present Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge contains much of the Montezuma Marsh. So I'm talking about some history of this area. The Montezuma Marsh was created by the last glacial age covering this area of North America. A large marshy area was created by sediment deposits at the northern end of what became known as Cayuga Lake. A marsh is a wet, low-lying land area with grassy vegetation and usually located nearby some body of water. As to the origin of the name Montezuma, it comes from Dr. Peter Clark. Dr. Peter Clark, Comfort Tyler, and Abram Morgan were probably the three earliest settlers in what is today the town of Montezuma. Dr. Peter Clark was a physician from New York City. He came to the area because of his interest in the recently discovered salt deposits under the lakes and marshes in this Finger Lakes area. Dr. Clark built a large, at least by 1808 standards, 12-room house atop a drumlin with a commanding view of the surrounding vast marshes. He called his home Montezuma. Dr. Clark, apparently a cosmopolitan traveler for that area, compared his hilltop home with the palace of the Aztec Emperor Montezuma in Mexico City. His home, the marshes, the village, and eventually the refuge all acquired the name Montezuma. In this 1918 view of the Parker Pond of the Montezuma Marsh, you can clearly see how the area is basically quite flat and wet, with lots of grassy vegetation. The Erie Canal was built through the Montezuma marshes in the 1820s. The initial canal was only 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, so it really didn't disrupt the marshes. I add that constructing this Erie Canal through the Montezuma marshes was a very difficult task of hard human labor. There were the widespread problems of insect bites and difficulties in many spots in the marshes of securing a solid enough base and wall to the dug canal so that that canal would stand up over time. The Erie Canal was so enormously successful from its very beginning of operation in 1825, the whole length of the canal, that by about 1850, the Erie Canal was being widened and deepened so that it could accommodate larger canal vessels. In the enlargement of the Erie Canal, the Richmond Aqueduct was constructed to carry the waters of the reconstructed or enlarged Erie Canal over the waters of the Cayuga and Seneca Canal. The Richmond Aqueduct was completed in 1857 and consisted of 31 stone arches over of a length of almost 900 feet. There were towpaths with a wooden trough that actually held the waters of the Erie Canal. This Richmond aqueduct enabled the Montezuma marshes to remain basically as they had for centuries. Before 1920, the state of New York completed its major renovation of the Erie Canal, with the Richmond Aqueduct removed so that the Erie Canal would now be at the same water level as the Seneca River and Canal. For purposes of this program, that renovation meant that the water level of the Seneca River throughout the Montezuma marshes was lowered by at least 8 feet. This caused a major draining of the natural marshes. This draining of much of the Montezuma marsh, however, did have the beneficial effect of creating a very fertile muckland area north and northeast of the present Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. This Montezuma marsh muckland area had rich organic material, such that with it being drained could become very fertile soil for growing vegetables. A portion of the Montezuma marsh did become the so-called savanna mucklands after much of the Montezuma marsh was drained because of the changes in elevation with the renovated barge canal through this area. With the draining of the Montezuma marsh, a large portion along Route 31 became an important agricultural area for the growing of potatoes, corn, and soybeans. In the village of Savannah at 1565 North Main Street, you can view this mural that depicts 3 scenes in the history of Savannah. The center scene shows the mucklands created by the extensive draining of the Montezuma marsh talked in the previous frames. These mucklands today are along Route 31 and became a major farming area for growing vegetables. For many years earlier, it was important for the growing of peppermint that was harvested for the Hotchkiss Peppermint Oil Company in Lyons. Now to get back to the history of how this Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge came about, it was in 1937 that the then predecessor of what we know today as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service purchased about 6,400 acres of the former marsh. The Civilian Conservation Corps then proceeded to construct a series of low dikes so as to begin to restore part of the marsh habitat. It was on September 12, 1938, that President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued his Executive Order 7971 to establish the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge as a refuge and breeding ground for migratory birds and other wildlife. The major tourist attraction of the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge is to view the many different kinds of bird species that will be at the refuge depending upon the season. Many of these bird species are migratory birds, flying the eastern U.S. migratory flyway. There is a very popular wildlife drive that is closed only in the winter. Nearly 1 million of over 25 different species of waterfowl do a stopover at this Montezuma refuge during their seasonal migration. Spring migration will have large numbers of Canada geese and snow geese, ducks in the early spring, In later spring will come the migratory shorebirds. Also at the Montezuma Refuge, baby bald eagles generally hatch mid-April. From mid-August through mid-October, there are large numbers of shorebirds migrating the other way. Then from mid-September to freeze up, there are geese and waterfowl that come back through the refuge on their way south to their wintering grounds. Of course, in recent years, we've had a growing number of Canada geese stay in the refuge and surrounding areas year-round. Tens of thousands of visitors come to the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge annually. Many come particularly to see the birds and other wildlife. I encourage visitors to the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, at least for their first visit, to first stop at the Visitor Center, which has many fine exhibits. You can pick up brochures, and there's a nice gift shop. Most visitors to the Montezuma Refuge take the 3.5-mile wildlife drive in their own vehicle, making stops wherever they want to carefully observe waterfowl and even taking pictures. On this wildlife drive, you can also stop and take a picture of the sculpture shown at right in this frame. This sculpture can also be seen while driving on the New York State Thruway, especially if you're headed eastbound. Also at the refuge, there are 2 observation towers that the public can climb to see better more of the refuge area. Also, there are 2 different trails for walking or hiking. There are 2 major highways that run east-west through the Montezuma Wildlife Refuge. The New York State Thruway basically cuts the Montezuma Refuge into 2 halves. Routes 5 and 20 go through the more southerly portion of the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. One of the most famous programs of the National Wildlife Refuge at Montezuma has been its program to increase the number of bald eagles in New York State. The bald eagle population was at a crisis point in New York State by 1960 because of the use of DDT, which created eagle eggs with shells too thin to hatch young. By 1960, there were only 1 known active bald eagle nest in all of New York State. In 1976, the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge began a formal program of breeding eagles so as to increase the eagle population. This breeding program has been very successful, to the point that around 2020, there were at least 15 eagle nests on or near the Montezuma Wetlands Complex. In April 2020, there were 14 eagles in 11 of those 15 nests. Here are some pictures to give you an idea of the nature of and size of bald eagle nests. There are many other types of large birds that are regularly seen in or around the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. One of this is osprey. If you drive along routes 5 and 20, which cuts through the northern portion of the Montezuma Refuge, you will see osprey nests on top of those high electrical poles. Another commonly viewed bird at the Montezuma Refuge is the great blue heron. In the last few decades, the Montezuma Wetlands Complex project has come about. This is a deliberate effort by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and Ducks Unlimited to protect, restore, and enhance wildlife in the greater Montezuma National Wildlife Area. More specifically, while the Montezuma Refuge comprises about 8,000 acres today, the Montezuma Wetland Complex comprises at least 36,000 acres. This makes the Montezuma Wetlands Complex one of the largest conservation projects in the entire United States for the reclamation of important wildlife and wetland habitat. This map shows the areas that make up the Montezuma Wetlands Complex. You can see visually how the Montezuma Wetlands Complex comprises much more than the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, which makes up most of what is color-coded in green on this map showing federal lands. The Montezuma Audubon Center, or MAC, is a state-owned facility through a cooperative agreement between the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the National Audubon Society. It houses a large exhibit area, classroom, nature store, and so on. On its 198 acres, there are 5 different types of habitat, 2 restored freshwater marshes, a 1-mile hiking trail, and an all-access observation platform. MAC opened in 2006. The MAC is located north of the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge on Route 89, just north of the village of Savannah. MAC conducts all kinds of public tours throughout the year, many of these concentrating on birding, such as the one shown. After all, there are many types of beautiful birds to see. Here is one example. You get to see birds in a natural setting, so you might get a beautiful photo such as this one. You can see birds partaking of fish in this natural setting. You can see migratory waterfowl landing on the water or taking off. You get to see and even experience a marsh up close. Here you see some migrating geese who use the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge as a major stopover point in the so-called Eastern Flyway of the United States. A common sighting is this, a flock of Canada geese in V formation. It is a truly beautiful sight to see Canada geese setting their wings, as it's called, to prepare for a landing. Here you see some Canada geese about to land. In the center, you see a pair of Canada geese with some other birds in the background and the foreground. Seeing thousands of snow geese on land and in the air is a common sight seasonally at the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. This is another common seasonal migratory site. This is a magnificent view that few visitors get to enjoy. This is a beautiful sight. I hope you have enjoyed learning more about the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge and its affiliates, such as the Montezuma Wetlands Complex and the Montezuma Audubon Center. This Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge is a very important part of our Finger Lakes history.